Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. The zombie genre has always had a core of devoted fans, myself included. But on Halloween night in 2010, everything changed with the premiere of AMC's The Walking Dead. Over the past 8 seasons, it has been one of, if not the most watched show on television.
Carl!
Just this week, Season 9 premiered, and while the episode was well received, much has been made of its low ratings compared to previous seasons' premieres. But it is a bit misleading, as The Walking Dead was still the most watched show this past Sunday night. It's just that the seasons before it, particularly seasons 4, 5, and 6, the numbers were just so huge that any drop in those ratings looks very substantial. But it's still a lot of people watching. During this zombie renaissance, we have seen a huge uptick in zombie representation in film and television, books, and perhaps most notably in video games, with titles such as The Last of Us, Left 4 Dead, Dead Island, and The Dying Light. Until recently, my opinion had been that the zombie genre is a lot of fun because there's no such thing as zombies. There's never been a zombie, so it's easy for us to play along, kind of role play. What would we do if we were faced with a zombie outbreak? How would we try to stay alive? And I think a lot of people identify with that. But my perspective has certainly changed since a conversation I had with my good friend and biologist, Dr. Lars Petersen. In the conversation, we discussed how, from a scientist's point of view, there are some real elements of bad science involved in the zombie genre. But that being said, there are some real-world examples of things like zombification that might even be more terrifying than the usual hordes of the undead we are familiar with. If you are a fan of the genre at all, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. But before we get to that, given the subject matter of the show, it's only fitting, I think, in the promo bit here, that I mention this Saturday, October 13th, is our very first running of our Incident at the Bunker, a Zombie Adventure. It will also be taking place on October 20th, 27th, 28th, and Saturday, November 3rd. And this is straight up one of the craziest things that we do, literally trying to drop you in the middle of your own zombie film. So you know there's going to be scares, there's going to be some humor, and there's going to be a whole lot of zombies. And all this takes place in an old Cold War era bunker, the Diefenbunker, Canada's Cold War museum located in Carp, Ontario, just outside of Ottawa. So if you are a fan of zombies at all and are anywhere close by, please come out and join us. You will have a great time. I will be there myself, scurrying around in the dark, and it's just something you have to experience to believe. Our Halloween season does continue in all 3 cities. Special tours going on in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. In Kingston, we are part of Fort Fright, taking place at Fort Henry National Historic Site, and we have a special Tales from the Tunnels experience going on there, where after experiencing some of the jump scares of the animatronics, we will share with you some of the real-life ghost stories from the fort. And it is an incredibly spooky place and has some tremendous stories. In Toronto, you could join us on our Ghosts and Spirits of the Distillery tour. The distillery is just a beautiful area in downtown Toronto, historically preserved. Is just a great backdrop for some ghost stories connected to Prohibition and some of the stores and shops in the area, and is also a great night out as we stroll along the cobblestone streets. Information about all of our Halloween experiences can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. If you are enjoying the show, be sure to subscribe so you know when the new episodes are coming out. And if you have a moment to drop a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to us, we'd be very appreciative. We'd also love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. A lot going on those channels as we get closer and closer to Halloween. Dr. Lars Petersen is a research scientist in the field of lung cancer biomarkers at the University of Calgary and an instructor of genetics and cell biology at Mount Royal University. More than that, he's a good friend of mine and one of the smartest dudes I know. Dr. Lars Petersen, thanks so much for joining us today on Haunted Talks.
I'm happy to be here.
Now, since you are a guest on the show and our topic is the science of zombies, is it correct to assume you are a fan of the zombie genre?
Among the horror genres, I think that zombies are one of the favorites for me, definitely.
Do you have a favorite zombie film that's kind of your touchstone?
Well, there's the classics. Night of the Living Dead invented the genre of zombies, and some of the George Romero classics are fantastic. But if I got to pick a favorite, it has to be Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, good choice. I love Shaun of the Dead. I mean, it's such a funny film. It plays on the conventions we know so well. I'm glad you mentioned George Romero as well. I think Dawn of the Dead, the zombies in the shopping mall, has to be my favorite. And, a recent one that I've just recently rewatched is Train to Busan, which is a great take, kind of the opposite, because zombies come in all shapes and sizes, as we know, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But some really fast-moving zombies in there, kind of like 28 Days Later. But let's kind of dive into the science of things, and more of a general question to start.
Sure.
As a scientist, does it affect when you're watching, whether it be a zombie film or an action film, when you see things that are problematic from a scientific point of view? How does that happen often, or are you able to just jump into the narrative as you go?
Well, I'm quite willing to suspend disbelief in many cases, but I do have a problem. And actually, zombies and zombie movies, and particularly TV shows like The Walking Dead, for example, I find my suspension of disbelief kind of getting a little bit too suspended, if you will. I have a hard time when I see a lot of these zombies clambering around and reaching out for the protagonists in the show or the movie, when all they have is just a skeletonized arm, and yet they're still moving their fingers around and things like that. I kind of roll my eyes at things like that. And you mentioned 28 Days Later. I think that's maybe the closest approximation to the kind of zombies that are maybe scientifically possible, because they don't actually seem to be dead. However, this whole idea of undead zombie is something that I have a hard time getting past a little bit.
Well, that's fair enough. And let's dive a little further into kind of this is perhaps unfair to the genre, as it is very fantastical to begin with. There's a lot of kind of science fiction or apocalyptic material is. But as we break down some elements of the zombie genre, what are the parts that are really unscientific or have no scientific basis? So here we're thinking about things, obviously just something coming back from life, being able to, as you said, sustain movement while presumably muscles are dying or not firing. What are your core concerns about the zombie genre from the scientific point of view?
Yeah, well, the concept of corpse reanimation is something that has been around for a long time. Obviously, Frankenstein, but even going back over 1,000 years in terms of getting some of the folklore. But for me, as a biologist, I look at any sort of corpse reanimation, and in particular something like zombies, as problematic because, for me, movement equals muscle contraction. And in order to have muscle contraction, you need to have input of three main things. You need cellular energy in the form of a molecule called ATP. ATP is a product of metabolism, of breaking down high energy molecules like glucose, fats, or even sometimes proteins. And then we need oxygen. Muscles can operate anaerobically for short periods of time, but ultimately they're going to need oxygen, which is going to help to produce that ATP that they need for movement. And in order to get oxygen, then we need to have lungs, and we need to have a functional circulatory system. And these are things that you wouldn't expect dead organisms to have. And then finally, we need some electrical stimulation from a functioning nervous system in order to tell which muscles to contract at the right time. And that requires a little bit of premeditated thought to go into that. Now, we can do some interesting things in laboratory settings. We can euthanize an animal and we can induce muscle contractions with electrodes. And if we can perfuse them with the right mix of nutrients and oxygen, we can keep those muscle contractions going for a fairly long period of time. But they do need that constant external input of electrical stimuli, and they need that constant supply of nutrients. So the idea of any sort of non-living organism moving on its own, independent of some form of support, is fiction, and I think it should be dismissed as such.
Now, another mainstay of the zombie genre is how the transmission of the virus, the infection, whatever the term that's used in the particular film or TV show, how that occurs. And what's the basis for kind of how quickly a virus can be spread? In some films, like Train to Busan, for example, the virus spreads almost instantaneously. But does that have any basis in science where we can see something transmitted that quickly, or is there always more of an incubation period?
Well, there is almost always an incubation period. The way that viruses propagate is they infect cells and they use the cellular machinery in order to produce more viral particles. And then those viral particles, once they reach sort of a critical mass, can be transmitted. So with typical viruses that we see, such as, let's go with a simple one, and we'll talk about the flu. The flu does require that incubation period before it becomes contagious, before you can pass it on to other people. And then it requires an even longer period of time before the symptoms start to appear. Once it reaches a sort of critical mass, that symptoms appear. And often those symptoms are caused by your own immune system trying to keep that infection in check. There are other types of viruses that do spread and become symptomatic a little bit more quickly. And I think the one that is maybe most relevant to zombieism is the rabies virus. It's famously linked to increased aggression in animals. As a sort of apropos touch, it is transmitted through saliva, so you can contract it from getting a bite or a scratch from an animal. And the dormancy period of that is fairly short, from a few days to maybe a week. People then become symptomatic. Initially, maybe the symptoms appear as a flu, but can progress to this kind of hyper-aggressiveness that we associate with rabies. But there's two problems. One problem is that, in my mind anyway, you need to have maybe even a bit of a longer dormancy period in order for a zombie apocalypse or a pandemic to break out, because you actually want to have infected people being infected, but being asymptomatic so that they can kind of spread out throughout the city or province in Canada or often even to different countries, so that you can infect the greatest possible populace. If you have a very short dormancy period, you're going to get people infected, but it's going to tend to be a much more local infection. If you can imagine these kind of small hotspots popping up, but then if you have these sort of very nasty viruses, like something like the rabies, one of the problems with rabies is that it will kill the host if it's not treated quickly, and it does this often by kind of cooking the host's brain. So I think that becomes a problem if we're talking about it in the context of creating this zombie pandemic, is that if you have a sort of local short dormancy virus being spread within a very small population that ultimately then die off, you're not going to see that spreading out to a population at large. Although it may make for a compelling small town zombie story.
So in this case, we're saying they would die out before the virus had a chance to spread. That's interesting. And another kind of staple of the genre, or something that sometimes plays a role, I'm thinking about World War Z, for example, or World War Z, depending where you are, and particularly the book, where they moved to colder climates one to slow down the zombies, but tied to transmission of the virus as well. Does temperature or other environmental factors play a role in how quickly viruses can be transmitted?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think that temperature can play a role, but what we think of as a typical response, a typical symptom that arises from a viral infection, is the development of a fever. We tend to treat fevers because they are uncomfortable, and in some cases they can be dangerous if the fevers get too high. But ultimately, a fever is your own body, your own immune system, attempting to fight off the infection. I don't necessarily think that it makes diseases less transmissible. Certainly, the idea of cooling your body temperature is difficult without inducing something like hypothermia in yourself. And viruses are not like us in that they don't really care too much about temperature. There's, an optimal temperature for things like bacteria to grow in. But even then, you need to get several degrees outside of their comfort zone for those to be affected. And I just don't see that happening in a human body. We have plenty of mechanisms built in to try and get us to maintain our nice, lovely 37 degrees Celsius body temperature. So moving up to the Arctic, we're still going to wear coats, and we're probably still going to live indoors. And unless we induce hypothermia across the entire population, it's probably not going to help much in terms of limiting the transmission.
I guess the final question about maybe some of the more fictitious elements of the genre, and you've kind of touched on this, but just to confirm, the idea of you have to shoot the zombie in the head, you have to destroy the brain is the only way to kill a zombie. What you're saying is, well, that's kind of beside the point, because if their brain was actually working in some type of functional manner, even if it's just sending electric impulses, you would still be alive at that point. So that's kind of the problem with destroying the brain, because the undead presumably aren't using their brains to begin with.
I would think so. To be honest, I think anything that's going to completely inhibit mobility is probably going to be just as effective. The typical shotgun to the head or a well-placed swing of a baseball bat or something like that will be just as effective as perhaps removing legs to prevent them from actually chasing after you.
A question I have when watching something like The Walking Dead, where the narrative takes place over many years, is there any reason to think that the human body in that condition would not decompose much faster? Is there any examples of any viruses that would keep the body in well enough shape that it could just be out walking around for several years in the elements and not break down or just fall apart?
I can't think of any specific examples in which you can preserve the body. There's a couple interesting parasitic funguses that exist in some tropical ecosystems. They have these apparent mind-controlling properties. So a typical fungi will have a life cycle in which they grow, they produce structures that make spores, and then ultimately they release the spores into the environment and allow them to germinate somewhere else, and that cycle repeats. There's a species of fungus called, I'm going to butcher the name here, it's Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. This is a species that is known to infect with its spores a certain type of tropical ant. It kills them, but it preserves their body, keeps their body intact, and actually keeps their nervous system relatively intact, despite the fact that the ant is dead. And these spores are able to manipulate the nervous system of the ant such that it is, and get that ant to actually leave its nest in the canopy, go down toward the forest floor where there's a better temperature and humidity that is more suitable for production of the spores for this, and then as sort of a final act of control, it'll get the ants to clamp down on a leaf with its mandibles, and then the fungus grows these fruiting bodies that rupture from the ant's head and releases more spores into the environment and out to infect more ants. An ant is a very different species to a human. Obviously, they've got an exoskeleton, and they are maybe a little bit more. I mean, if you've ever found a dead fly in your windowsill, they can last there for months without looking like they've decomposed very much. Humans, on the other hand, We're soft, squishy things, and I can't imagine that there'd be much that would actually be able to keep us intact from the perspective of a viral infection or something like that.
And just to drill down on the ant example a little more, I mean, is a fungus considered a living organism then? Is it kind of like a bizarre form of puppetry then taking place?
Yeah, so fungi are, I would argue that fungi are more of a living organism than viruses are, whereas viruses require host cells and the cells of the hosts to grow and propagate themselves. Viruses aren't capable of propagating themselves on their own. This fungus is an example of a highly adapted type of fungus that is using these ants as part of their life cycle, but they can grow. I mean, other funguses can grow without needing to take over a zombie ant in order to do that. But it is a form of, as you say, a bit of form of puppetry in that it's controlling the ant. There are some other examples of this in nature where you have this kind of mind control thing. So outside of the tropical forest, you can come to your own home, to your litter box. Many cats, particularly stray cats, are infected with a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, which produces a disease called toxoplasmosis, which you may have heard of. Toxoplasmosis is relatively symptomless in humans, but it can't go through its own life cycle unless it's in the body of a cat. So if you are a individual infected with toxoplasmosis, you actually tend to have a bit of a higher affinity for cats. And in particular, you tend to be a little bit less put off by the smell of cat urine. But where this is important is if you are a Toxoplasma gondii parasite and you've found your way into the belly of something like a rodent or a rat or a mouse, the parasite itself wants to get itself into the belly of a cat. So the way that it does this is, again, through a little bit of this mind altering or mind control in which it reduces the inhibition or reduces the sense of fear that these rodents experience towards cats, and in particular prevents them from sort of being on guard or being afraid when they detect the smell of cat urine. And in some cases, they're actually drawn to the smell of cat urine, which makes them much easier prey.
That is some weird science.
It is. It is.
That's crazy. Can change someone's disposition towards cats. And isn't that the one that's particularly dangerous for pregnant women?
It is, and so in humans it's relatively symptomless, but the big danger is the fetuses that the pregnant women are carrying can suffer from developmental defects. Often blindness results, or there can be some development problems that arise in those fetuses. Neither the ants nor the ants are kind of a little bit zombified, but certainly the toxoplasmosis doesn't necessarily directly relate to zombieism. But in both cases, we don't really understand the underlying genetic mechanisms behind these mind control properties. And, we know that over evolution, we have common ancestors from which we have retained a lot of the genetic information, but the, sort of million years of evolution have caused those genes to be inactivated or cause them to sort of lie dormant in our own genome. So, who knows what kind of mutation could give these genes a little bit more activity in our own bodies and create weird mind-controlling properties in our own cells.
Now, I bet some of our listeners would be surprised, and I am as well, to hear, a scientist say, well, we don't really have any idea how that works, or not a firm idea. And just a vague question for science overall. How much stuff is there we don't really know or don't really understand how it works yet?
I would say most of it. we don't understand how it works. And even stuff that we do say that we understand how it works, we really understand it on what's described as a reductionist scale. So think about a car engine. You can understand how breaking the carburetor in an engine, for example, is going to cause that engine to not work. That doesn't mean that the carburetor is the most important part of the engine. And it certainly doesn't mean that whenever an engine breaks down, you fix the carburetor, and that's how it works. And that's a lot of the ways that we study cells, cell biology in particular. We will look at a cell, we'll find something that we think is important, we'll scientifically break it in the lab and see what the effect is. And if all of a sudden the cell does some weird things, we make the conclusion that that thing that we broke is somehow responsible for preventing this from happening in the cell. But Again, from a reductionist perspective, there could be any number of different things that rely on that one thing, and maybe it could be one of those pathways that keeps that weird thing in control. So certainly we're getting a better grasp of trying to understand biology as a system rather than individual components, but we still have a long way to go, definitely. And I'm talking about the sort of microscopic level, but if we expand beyond biology into other sciences, then certainly there's way more that we don't know than what we do know.
And speaking of weird and creepy things, there are some other ties to the natural world, to the field of biology, where it's not exactly zombieism, but there may be some other things that are kind of linked or would remind us of the genre in some ways. Are there other things in the natural world which we might find creepy in this similar vein?
There are a number of other transmitted diseases that are quite interesting. One that I think is maybe relevant to this idea of zombieism is these particles that we've identified. They're infectious protein particles called prions. And prions, you'll maybe be familiar with in some neurodegenerative diseases, such as mad cow disease, in cows, obviously, scrapie in sheep, and humans, a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. These things are kind of interesting because they're proteins. So these are not living organisms. They're not even viruses, but these are proteins that have misfolded. They exist normally in our body, and in particular in structures like our brain. These disease prions can convert these normal prions in the brain into this wrong conformation, so they can propagate themselves that way. They clump together, they kill surrounding brain tissue and create this kind of spongy brain. So it's called a spongiform encephalitis, getting its name from the fact that there's these holes in the brain. Anytime you're messing around with the brain, there's a possibility that you're going to affect something that has something to do with these behavioral changes that you'd anticipate would be kind of zombie-like. So, we look at regions of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, which is the region that we link with logical reasoning and decision making. And so if you decrease activity in that region, you're going to have sort of more spontaneous activity, not thinking about consequences of the activity. And if you then increase regions of the brain, or activity in regions of the brain, such as the amygdala, this is a region that's linked with fear. You can see how you create this kind of anxious or aggressive type personality. And actually, it's kind of interesting that these regions of the brains that have been linked with these things, you look at perpetrators of violent crimes, actually tend to have either smaller prefrontal cortices, or they have less activity in their prefrontal cortex. So you get that less of that idea of consequence to your actions. And so something like a prion punching holes in your prefrontal cortex, you could end up driving something like that. But I guess the problem with prions is that the primary form of transmission is consumption of infected tissue. So there would be kind of the reverse zombie, where you'd have healthy people needing to eat zombie brains in order to become infected, and that doesn't really work that well.
not in most cases, I don't think.
No, but I do have my own favorite theory for how zombieism could come about.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear it.
If you'll indulge me.
Yeah, absolutely.
My primary field of research is cancer biology, and one of the more interesting ideas in cancer biology is the idea of a transmissible cancer. So cancer, and by definition, is a disease of the self, and all the other things that we've talked about, maybe with the exception of prions, but viruses and parasites and bacteria, eventually, if they don't kill us, then our body's immune system will fight them off. But because cancer is a disease of your own cells, they go down this path that sort of alters their biology to a point where they can't self-control their growth. They develop properties that allow them to break free of the primary tumor and travel through the body and set up these secondary sites of growth elsewhere, often, coincidentally, tissues that have high metabolic activity like the brain. But because they're a disease of the self, typically our own immune system will not recognize and attack these. But what that means is that if one individual has a cancer and somehow another individual comes in contact with that cancer, their immune system will be able to recognize that and fight that off. But there's a couple really interesting exceptions to this. I'll tell you about one of them. The Tasmanian devil has a form of a transmissible cancer that presents itself as a really nasty, bleeding, pussy tumor around the mouth and face, and it's capable of being transmitted to other devils through their sort of normal activity, which involves a lot of biting, and especially biting each other around the face. And so they can pass on these cancer cells from one individual to another. And the reason why it's able to survive in these other hosts is there's a series of genes that are called major histocompatibility complexes, or MHCs. Normally, my MHCs on my cells are going to be recognizably different than MHCs on your cells or somebody else's cells. And so if they get introduced into our body, our immune system will recognize those as something else and will fight them off. But through a combination of inbreeding, which makes these genes very similar between individuals of the population of Tasmanian devils, as well as a decreased expression of these MHC genes, these contagious tumors can actually pass from one individual to another relatively undetected by the immune cells. So we have these cancer cells passing from one individual to another. The immune system is not recognizing them. They're allowed to sort of set up a primary metastasis again around the mouth. We have these same genes in ours. Now, ours tend to be much more variable between us and other individuals. However, you can imagine that it would take one individual to have some sort of wonky expression within their MHC gene set, where you get either decreased expression or something like that allows them to be undetectable by another person's immune system. Now, what becomes interesting there is that these particular tumors tend to be pretty metastatic. So they'll set up those primary sites, but they already have a lot of those properties that allow them to break free from that primary site of tumorigenesis and move throughout the body. So my zombie apocalypse comes by the fact that these tumors can be transmitted from individual to individual. And then one of the properties of many different cancers is that when they metastasize, they go to regions of high metabolic activity, such as the brain. And in fact, many of these target particular areas of the brain. So if we target a tumor into the prefrontal cortex, there is evidence suggesting that in some cases, brain metastases are linked with increased aggression in an individual. And so all that's missing is for us to sprinkle in a little bit of parasitic mind control, and I think you've got a recipe for a full-on zombie outbreak.
That is absolutely terrifying and disturbing. And just so we're clear, there's no examples of transmission of cancer in this way right now in humans. Is that right? Or is this actually happening anywhere?
No examples of it happening in humans.
Thank goodness.
But the two primary examples of this have been, as I mentioned, the Tasmanian devils, but also there's another form of transmissible cancer that occurs in some populations of dogs, in which case it's actually passed on sort of similar mode of transition as a venereal disease. And what's interesting about that, it's a little bit more spread across the planet. They've taken samples of these tumors and actually can build a little bit of a phylogenetic tree that traces back this original transmissible tumor in the dogs back to one small population of dogs, I believe, that used to be based somewhere in Africa. I can't remember the country.
So, and just so we got your pet theory correct here, we're talking about a contagious cancer that may prompt development of tumors in the brain, therefore causing behavioral changes.
Yes, and what's nice about this is that it would have a relatively long dormancy period. Cancers are not a very fast-acting disease, as we know, but once a cancer reaches its metastatic stage, things can progress quite quickly. But also, they don't immediately kill the host. Again, you're looking at maybe months to possibly years of zombie infection activity. Capability.
So it would have to be a trilogy of some sort or something.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, we're kind of having fun talking, obviously, about zombies, but you're also doing some real work, important work in the field of cancer research. Could you share with us a little bit about what you're up to?
Nothing as exciting as trying to fight cancer zombie apocalypse, but But my primary area of research is lung cancer. And in particular, me and my research group are trying to identify some targetable biomarkers in lung cancer. There are a few that exist already, but trying to find novel ways of treating lung cancer that can perhaps take advantage of some existing therapies that are more commonplace in the lung cancer or cancer treatment field that don't require specific genetic mutations or things like that. And so if we can find some of these and both increase the efficacy of some of these chemotherapies as well as decreasing the side effects that typically come with chemotherapy, then I think that would be a lofty goal and something that we're trying to achieve.
And if our listeners are interested in following your work or your team's work, is there anywhere they could go to kind of follow along with developments as they're occurring?
I work at the University of Calgary, and our research group is called the Glands Look Lung Cancer Research Group. We do a lot of work related to following patients' clinical information and trying to understand how that relates to their outcome, but also trying to look at some of these genomic and genetic alterations that occur within these patients. We have a website, it's glandslook.ca. People are welcome to go there. And we are a donation-based research group. People are welcome to come there and support lung cancer research.
In the name of zombies.
In the name of preventing the future lung cancer-based zombie apocalypse.
That seems more than reasonable. Dr. Lars Petersen, thanks so much for joining us today and discussing the ins and outs of the zombie genre. I do feel much better prepared now if apocalypse was to break out.
Well, thank you, Jim. It was great to be here.
A big thank you to Dr. Lars Petersen for joining us today. And certainly I think all of us want to wish him and his colleagues all the best in their very important and ongoing research into cancer. Tickets for our Halloween season in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto are vanishing quickly, so to grab yours or to pick up some information about all the stuff we have going on, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. As always, thanks to our amazing Haunted Walk team, including Jillian Walker-Chuck, our expert guest wrangler, Michelle Dennis, our incredible audio editor, and to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again next week, sweet dreams.